So if you're betting on football, or you're Betfair trading football, or you're doing anything in a football market that involves a bet of some sort, there are a whole range of different markets that you can bet on. However, they are all related, and it's an important thing to understand if you're going to be betting or trading on football. And it also throws very sharp light on the sort of systems that people often come up with, because it shows that a lot of them don't make any sense whatsoever. But it also shows you what your true objective is when you're betting or trading on football. So let's explore that in this video. If you're interested in learning to trade on Betfair, then visit the BetAngel Academy, where you have detailed, structured Betfair trading courses. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon if you want notification of new videos as they're released. So I had an unusual conversation this week with somebody. He presented a system to me and he sort of said, well, if you do this and you do that, and then this is at this price and that is at that price, and then this is here and that is there, then this is when this system sort of comes into play. And I said to him, well, that's a bit of a nonsense really, isn't it? And he said, well, why is that? And I said, well, because all the markets are interrelated. One market determines the price in another, and that has always been the case within football. There is no difference between that. And one bit of information over here doesn't really dictate much information over there, because the two will reflect that core piece of information. Now, I have done loads of videos on analysing football matches, and they contain pretty much all of the stuff that you need. So have a look at those videos. I'll tag some on the end of this particular video so that you can understand it. But you need to look specifically at how many goals are being scored and how they're being distributed and that sort of thing. Because ultimately that is the core fundamental aspect of all football, is basically how many goals are going to be scored and who scores them. However, from there you can derive a whole range of other things. And the conversation I had this week was, this guy was sort of saying, well, if this is this price, then I'll do this in this market. And I said to him, well, no, you need to understand that it's all that linked together. And I did actually produce a video on this a few years ago, and a spreadsheet that went with it. So I thought, well, let's revisit that spreadsheet so that I can explain in greater depth exactly what the fundamental core concept is. You don't need to use the spreadsheet, but by using it I can illustrate to you exactly how all of these markets are related. But there's also a really critical, important thing to understand about the football markets, which I'll talk about after we've gone through this exploration and discussion of how all these markets are linked. So without further ado, let's have a look at that. So I'm keen not to blind you with science, but it's an important point to make as to understand how all of the football markets are interlinked. Because when people say, I see lots of stuff, ebooks, general comments, all sorts of weird and wonderful, strange strategies, and they all seem to completely fail to understand how football markets are interlinked. So I think it's an important thing to be able to discuss and get across with a key point. And the fact is that this spreadsheet is something that exists already. You can download it on the BetAngel forum. I can't quite remember when I first did it. It was some time ago. But I've amended that original sheet for continuity to highlight a few other points and to just point out to you how interrelated football markets are. So when we look at this spreadsheet, I'll briefly describe what it is before going into the detail. The spreadsheet was originally designed to be hooked up to Excel. So you can see along the bottom here, we've got the links to the Excel linking via BetAngel. And if you want to know how to do this, I will put the original video, which is probably quite old now, at the end of this video. So you can see how it is possible to hook up all of these individual markets. But when that data is in there, then it basically starts to put that data into all of the other markets. But the key market that we're looking at here is the correct score market. So if we look at the sheets that BetAngel is linked to, we can see we've got the match odds market, we have the correct score market, and then we have various over and under goal markets. But in fact, the only one that we really need is the correct score market, because that contains all the data to price most of the other markets. There are a couple of little exceptions which I will describe, but fundamentally that's why we've got the match odds market and the correct score market in here as well. But I'll describe how this spreadsheet is constructed, and at the end of this video you'll totally understand how football markets are constructed. So you can see here we've got the chance of a 0-0 draw. This is taken from the correct score spreadsheet. So this is actually looking at the chance of a 0-0, which is currently odds of 13.5, and it's calculating out what that is as a percentage. So you can see it's looking at that particular market. And then we've basically done the same for all of the other markets over here. Now, one thing that this spreadsheet does that's quite clever if you actually use it live is as individual scores become null, in other words, a goal goes in, then it will actually eliminate all of the possible paths that don't or can no longer exist. So, you know, that's quite an interesting experiment to do. It's probably worth downloading the spreadsheet and playing around with it. And people created new versions of it on the forum as well. But each one of these score lines here, you'll notice, is from the correct score market, all the way from 0-0 out to 3-all. And we've basically put all of those odds in there, and we've added up all of those percentages. And this is where it starts to get interesting, because you begin to understand the way that the market is all linked together. And if we actually look at individual components of this, you will begin to understand how that all becomes possible. So if I highlight all of this area here, this is the correct score market. These are all of the correct scores, all of the odds that are applied to those individual scores. And that is 100% of that particular market. However, to get derivative information, to derive the other markets from here, is quite simple. So if we look at 0-0, that's basically telling us that there will be no goals. So if we look at the no goal market, or the under 0.5 market, you have all of a sudden that derivative there. So 0-0 obviously relates to other types of markets. Now, if we look at the 1 goal market, this is basically adding up the correct score of 1-0 and 0-1. That's the only way that you could possibly have 1 goal within a particular market. And then you can see we've done the same for 2 goals, 3 goals. So can you see this is 0 goals, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. I had to think about that. This is 5, and this is 6. So you can see there that directly correlates. If we want to know if there are going to be 3 goals in the market, these are the number of correct scores that would deliver that to us, and that is the total of that particular result. So you can see there we can actually derive how many goals are being discounted into the market. Then what I've done on here as well is I've basically said if there's a 17.78 chance of 1 goal, that equals an average of 0.18 goals. And then we've done, if there are 2 goals, what's 2 multiplied by the percentage chance of 2 goals occurring? And then we've gone all the way along the line, and we add that up, and then you can see that this market is discounting about 2.2 goals. Amazing. So you can actually see that the number of goals within the match is directly discounted from the correct score market. You can see that straight away. So of course that means that determines what happens in the over and under goal market. So we've got here under 2.5 goals, and what this is basically it's adding up those particular values. So you can see here under 2.5 goals is no goals plus 1 goal plus 2 goals. That makes sense, doesn't it? So if you look at that, you can actually see that that is where you derive your over and under 2.5 goal markets from. So you can see here, according to the correct score market, the under 2.5 goal market should be priced at 2.01. And when we look at the actual market, it's priced at 2.02. The opposite of that is over. So you can see that would be priced at 1.99 and the actual market is 1.97. Now the actual market contains an overround, a percentage accrued to the other side of the book, the theoretical margin. And that's where a little bit of this discrepancy comes from. But you can basically do this calculation all the way down the line. And then it turns out that the correct score market derives the number of particular goals within the market and also therefore the over and under goals within that particular market. I hope this is all beginning to make sense to you now. And so you can see here we've plotted out a little chart talking about the number of goals in the market and how likely that is. So there's a 25% chance of 2 goals. There's, you know, so much percentage of 3. And so that gives you a shape to the match. And this is one of the things that I use when I'm pricing up a market, is I'll look at the shape of the match against my shape and see if there's a little discrepancy and if I can account for that and, you know, why is value being created there, if indeed it is being created. But you can also see I've actually put here the winning chance of this particular match as well. It's interesting because as I'm recording this video, Wolves are going to play Olympiacos to go into the next round of the Europa League. And when I first recorded this video, we had Olympiacos and Arsenal. Isn't that a bit of a coincidence? Maybe there's some fate running through the universe that has caused me to do that. The only reason I'm using the older sheet is because that's the template that is on the forum. So it makes sense if I use something that you can actually see and relate to when you watch this video and use the spreadsheet. But if we actually, when we looked down this column, it was telling us that there are going to be 2 goals in a match. When we looked down this column, it told us what chance there was of there being 5 goals. But if you actually look at the way that I've split this spreadsheet up, you can actually see that all of the lines in the middle here are the draw. So you can see 0-0, 1-1, 2-1, 3-1, and the chance of those occurring. And then you can actually add that up to equal the chance of a draw. So you can see that is where that percentage chance comes from. And by default, therefore, if you add up all of the scores above this, you can see that I've done this along here and then subtotal it here. That is telling you the chance of a home win. And all the ones below there are going to do the opposite. They're going to tell you the chance of the away win. So the interesting thing about this is you can actually add all of those things together and we suddenly get the number of goals that are likely, how many are going to be scored within the match in total, but we also get the over and unders, and we also get the chance of a home win, a draw, or an away win. So just one single market gives us all of those derivatives. So this is what I'm saying about the way that the markets are interrelated. They are all derived from one another. So you could say that the 2.5 goal market influences the correct score and the correct score influences the 2.5, and both of them influence the match odds. But there's no discrepancy between them. They're all, if one moves, the other is very, very likely to move. Now, there's an important caveat to insert in terms of the overall winning chance here. The correct score market only goes from 0-0 to 3-all and all variations in between. But of course, it's not impossible that a team could win 4-0, 5-0, 6-0. It is possible to calculate those out and to derive those. I've done a video, which again I will put at the end of this one, on the correct score market, or predicting correct scores. But you can see, because we don't have all of those scores in there, this does lead to a little discrepancy at the bottom here. So you can see the match odds are saying Olympiacos have a 49% chance, but our spreadsheet is only saying a 41% chance. And that is because we're missing all of those other scores on this particular sheet. Now there is a correct score 2 market, which you could use as well, and that would pad that out for you. But there are other ways of doing it, some of which I discuss on the predicting correct score video. But can you see how all of these markets are correlated? They all derive out of each other, and the core thing that sits below all of these is basically the strength of the home team against the away team and the number of goals that are going to be scored in a match. That is the core thing with football. If you predict that correctly, you will spot and can identify discrepancies within the overall market. And talking of that, we need to talk about how this market is represented on Betfair as well.
So yeah, hopefully that's showing you how all of these markets are linked up together and how they all form a price based around that linkage. Hopefully you can see how correct score plays into the match odds markets, but how both of them, whichever way you look at it, they're sort of interlinked, and you can play it forward or backwards, but basically you can see that they're joined at the hip. And then that also applies to the under and over market, and basically pretty much every market. I can describe how all of those things are linked together for you. And you can, it's too long for this video, but there are some other interesting depth in secondary and tertiary markets that occur within football and how they're linked as well. But the most important thing to understand here is, when I first turned up on Betfair, there was no linkage between these markets. So I actually spent time creating prices on one market as a derivative of another. And I would do a thing called synthetic arbitrage, which is, if the market didn't exist, you could sort of create that market by placing positions in different markets and taking advantage of the differential between the two. And I bet you lots of people were looking at this video and thinking, oh, there's probably an opportunity somewhere. Is there a discrepancy somewhere? Well, I can tell you that there is no discrepancy between these markets for two reasons. One is, way back in whenever I started doing the football, the first thing that I did was actually started pricing markets, because I knew how they were all priced up and how they all linked together. So people like me have been around doing that for 20 odd years or so on. However, there was a fundamental change in the way that the markets operated a few years back, and that was a thing called cross-matching. Now, cross-matching on Betfair is difficult to explain, but basically if you place a bet on one side of the book and it can be placed on another side, then the two bets get placed simultaneously, and whichever one gets taken first gets the other side matched. But what Betfair did on football markets is they did a thing called cross-matching. Betfair know how these markets are linked up, so as a consequence they decided to link up those markets as well. So if you place a bet on one football market, it will actually appear on another. So whether you like it or not, the markets are absolutely fundamentally completely joined at the hip. Even if you do something in one market, it will appear in another, and that is simply because if you're doing a correct score, then those odds will reappear somewhere else, and if you're doing an over and under, then that will appear in the correct score, and the correct score influences the match odds. So whichever way you look at it, all these markets are intertwined. Not only that, but Betfair have actually deliberately intertwined them in recent years. Can't quite remember when that first came into play, but this is one of the things that sort of undermines any process or system that relies upon you looking at one market and trying to decide what to do in another, because they're basically almost exactly the same. All you're doing is looking at it from a slightly different angle. So even if you wanted to exploit a differential between these two markets now, it's very unlikely that that differential will actually exist, simply because not only will people be doing it anyway, but Betfair have actually got that mechanism in place to do it automatically. So anyhow, I hope that's filled out your knowledge a little bit more on football, and hopefully you'll be able to use that to get a deeper understanding of the market. If you have a strategy that's revolving around goals, you can work out how many goals there are, or if you want to understand what the market is discounting and how that changes or is different from what you're seeing in reality, then you'll be able to do that as well. And if you want to download that spreadsheet, it's available on the forum, and people did actually update and do their own versions of it and upload that to the forum as well, and I recommend that you download that, link that up, and then you can have a good old play around with all of those different characteristics. Anyhow, I hope that video has been useful for you.